And I want to first start out by thanking our sponsors, which I have up on the screen here. Metro State University Department of Social Work. We have the Multidisciplinary Center on Aging at Anschutz Medical Campus. Seniors Resource Center, InnovAge, and our own Colorado Senior Lobby Board of Directors, and Primetime News. And Rich Morrow and I will be kind of co-moderating the panel today. I know I see Rich is on, but I don't see Rich himself. But I know he's there.
Yeah, I'm getting there.
Okay, well, there you are.
Stairs for a minute.
All right. And I want to remind all of our attendees today to use the Q&A feature if you have a question that pops into your mind as we're going through our presentations. And I will begin by introducing our panelists for today. So I'm going to see if I can do this spotlight thing. There we go. So I'll introduce Tom. Tom Dermody is our principal legislative analyst in the Joint Budget Committee, which is a team of about 16 people. Tom earned his master's in public policy and environmental policy from George Washington University. Next up, we have Sharon Eubanks. And Sharon is an attorney and joined the Office of Legislative Legal Services in 1986 and was appointed as its director in 2017, leading a staff of about 50 people. And next is Ashley Clark. Ashley is the Deputy Director in the Office of State Planning and Budgeting, focusing on health, human services, and criminal justice. Ashley holds a master's in public policy analysis from UC Berkeley. And then our final panelist is Manish Jani, who joined the Legislative Council staff in 2004 and is now Deputy Director and serves as the IT Director for the legislature. Manish holds a master's in computer science from the University of Mumbai. So thanks again to all our panelists for joining and for all of you who have joined as attendees today. I'd like to start with you, Sharon, and if you could describe for us what your office does and how you work with the legislature. And I'm going to ask each of you the same question, so start with Sharon. Thank you.
Okay, well, good morning. The Office of Legislative Legal Services is statutorily charged with providing legal services to the General Assembly. So we do that in a variety of ways. Basically, we're the nonpartisan in-house counsel for the General Assembly. We serve all 100 members equally, doesn't matter what their party affiliation is. As Bob mentioned, we've got 50 employees, 27 attorneys, and 23 other folks that are everything from legislative editors, publications folks, administrative staff, and an HR person. I think probably our biggest responsibility in working with the General Assembly is drafting of legislation. We draft all the bills, resolutions, and memorials, and those things have to go through our office. Somebody just can't come up with their own bill draft and introduce it. So it has to go through our office so it conforms with all the required formats. We draft most of the amendments to legislation as they're being offered as they work through the legislative process. And we also draft all of the conference committee reports. So we're heavily involved with the members from the get-go in terms of any ideas that they have for legislation. They file a bill request with our office and we assign an attorney to that bill request. We have 3 subject matter teams that are divided based on subject matter expertise, and so a bill on a particular subject, such as property taxation, would go to one particular team where they have folks that specialize in that subject area. We also work with the House and the Senate in terms of as bills work through the legislative process. We review all the bills that are enacted by one House. We look for conflicts between different pieces of legislation so that if there's two bills that are amending the same provision, but perhaps differently, we work to try to resolve those conflicts before the bills get enacted. We also look for any sort of technical or substantive defects. We're also responsible for the publications. We have several publications that we're responsible for. One you may have occasion to look at is the digest of bills that our office produces at the end of each session. It's a brief summary of all the legislation enacted during a session. We are also responsible for publishing the session laws of Colorado, which is an annual publication that reflects all of the legislation enacted during a session, and then also the Colorado Revised Statutes. So we take whatever the General Assembly enacts into law and actually incorporates that into the existing law so that it's harmonized and put in its proper place. We also perform a lot of legal research for members. A lot of times they'll have questions about various issues and they'll want to know, can I even do this as legislation? Are there any legal issues or impediments? And so we do a lot of legal research, legal opinions at times when people want something more official. Our opinions are not binding on the members of the General Assembly. They're provided to assist them in the performance of their legislative duties. We also coordinate litigation involving the General Assembly, the members, and the staff. Just most recently, there was a challenge to the Blue Book, the 2020 Blue Book, in District Court, and we were involved in representing Natalie Mullis and the Legislative Council in successfully defending in that challenge. We also review administrative rules of the executive branch agencies. This is sort of a check and balance between the executive and legislative branches in terms of ensuring that the rules promulgated by executive agencies are within their authority and don't conflict with statutes. The way the process is set up is that rules promulgated by executive agencies expire after 1 year unless they're extended by legislation. And so our office reviews all of the rules that are promulgated within a cycle that may be subject to the upcoming rule review bill. And generally most of them are extended, but some that have problems that we feel are in conflict or not within the agency's authority, if the General Assembly agrees, those rules are not extended. We also provide legal assistance with contracts for the various agencies in the General Assembly. And you might know that our office is also involved in several respects with the initiative process. Our office, along with Legislative Council staff, conduct review and comment meetings where questions are posed to the proponents of proposed initiatives. And our office also has a member of the title board that sets the ballot questions that, for example, you'll see on the 2020 ballot. One of our folks was involved in coming up with that language. So I think that, in a nutshell, is what we do, sort of short and sweet, but I could go on and on. I'll let you go for that.
That's a big nutshell, Sharon. Thank you. Okay. So Manish, would you answer the same question, if you would, please? What does your office's function do, and how do you work with the legislature? You're on mute, Manish. You're on mute.
There we go. Okay.
There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, okay. Good morning, everybody. So Legislative Council staff is one of the 4 nonpartisan legislative staff agencies that support the legislature, the House and Senate. I like to say that legislative council staff does everything that the other four agencies don't, right? So we're kind of a catch-all in a way. Some of the primary responsibilities of legislative council staff was put together to provide research, nonpartisan research for the legislators. So that's one of its primary goals, primary responsibilities. Additionally, over time, it's expanded into other roles such as providing committee support. The committee staff you see, staffing these committees are legislative council staff. We do school finance, all the fiscal notes attached to bills done by legislative council staff, for economic forecasting. And the economists are part of this agency. Well, something that you may not realize is the construction management, a lot of construction work that goes on in the building. We work, legislative council staff manages a lot of that too. Accounting services for the entire legislature, visitor services, capital tours. One of the more public-facing, other than visitor services, is another one is constituent services. Your requests that you send out to legislators for help tend to go to our constituent services staff, who actually do the research and respond. We do provide support for the redistricting initiative too that's coming up on now. The legislative print shop is part of our organization, our team. All the introduced bills and calendars, terms are printed in-house. And last but not least is the information technology aspect for support for the legislatures, part of legislative council staff. So it's kind of a lot of different things form legislative council staff agency.
Oh yeah, yes, it's a big bucket. Thank you. Tom, Dermody?
Yeah, for sure. So Joint Budget Committee, kind of written into our name, we are the dedicated staff for the Joint Budget Committee. It's obviously it's a six-person committee split between the chambers and the various parties. Our staff provides, well, our really heavy season starts in November, when we get the budget requests from the departments and the executive. And our staff provides the nonpartisan analysis and recommendations for those budget requests for the upcoming fiscal year. That is sort of our primary reason to be. And that takes up the vast majority of our time, is managing and assessing the budget as we go through the process. So any mid-year adjustments during the supplemental phase, any of the upcoming discussions, we are sort of the touch point for all of the legislators when they have questions about any specific requests or any specific programs in terms of how they've been budgeted, their expenditures. We're sort of the point people on the construction of that budget. Obviously, the final determinations and decisions are made first by the members on the committee, and then they throw the finalized budget across the street for consideration from the General Assembly as a whole. Our staff role in all of this is really information provision. We're here to provide as much and as accurate information as we can in a timely fashion. Obviously, things move quickly. This past session was a unique session, to say the least. But sort of the essence of what we do is always going to be the same. We provide whatever research information we can to answer the questions of the various legislators when they come knocking on our doors, either virtually or in person. And that's kind of how we interact. We are the way I like to think of it is we're kind of the gardeners of the budget. Year over year, we're watching trends. We're making sure that we're keeping track of efficiencies and any reversions. We're making sure that any programs that need to be addressed or discussed are discussed and brought to the forward. We discuss obviously the executive priorities and policy priorities that they have and how they impact the budget. We're a relatively small office. There's 13 analysts. And so we each have multiple departments. Most of us all have multiple departments and multiple responsibilities in terms of the budget areas that we have. Our interaction with the legislators is, we're primarily interacting with the members of the Joint Budget Committee. We have a lot of FaceTime with them. We're presenting in front of them almost daily, as starting in November, going through about mid-March. With the General Assembly as a whole, we're here as a research and as an information source for them. A lot of times it's after the budget has been finalized and passed to the legislature that we really start to interact with the General Assembly as a whole as we go into the appropriation season, which is where, sort of that last month of a normal session, we staff the appropriations committees in both the House and the Senate. And so we're writing our fiscal analyses, our appropriations analyses, which accompany the fiscal notes when they're brought forward in front of the appropriations committees. And that's really where we have a lot of the more broad discussions with the various legislators as we're trying to help them figure out how they can finance and fund their various bills and the various bills that go through the process after the budget has been passed. So our primary responsibility really is to help the committee and provide information for the committee as they set the budget. And then our secondary is staffing the appropriations committees, where we provide appropriations analyses for each bill that gets heard by the committee.
Okay, thank you, Tom. That covers a lot of territory as well. I think people are beginning to see how much activity goes on behind the scenes of the legislature and how the legislature couldn't function very well without all these folks that have been speaking this morning. And I'll turn to Ashley next to talk about what her office does. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think I'm the only one here from the executive branch. But for those of you who don't know, the Office of State Planning and Budgeting, which we call the OSPB, our primary role is to provide the governor with timely and complete information and recommendations so he can make sound public policy and budget decisions. So what that means is, well, currently we're knee deep in budget season. So Tom said that his busy season is January. Right now is our busy season. So we're developing a budget that reflects the governor's priorities, but also advances effective government. This involves working with departments to develop requests that will eventually be reviewed by Tom's shop and everyone over at the JBC staff. We also work very closely with the Joint Budget Committee and work with their staff on the best allocation of resources, both with decision items and then also providing information through the request for information. And then lastly, OSPB also has a forecasting team, and they work on forecasts that are presented to the Joint Budget Committee about 3 or 4 times a year. So that's kind of the big overview of what we do. But it's exciting and it's fun and it's interesting, and right now it's crazy.
So I guess it's fair to say that the governor's budget is the one that kicks off the whole budget season. Would that be correct?
Yeah, so the governor presents a budget. Typically it's November 1st, but since November 1st this year is a weekend, it's I think November 2nd. And then the Joint Budget Committee goes through what is presented in that budget and looks at individual decision items, what we've saved, what we're putting forward, and kind of reacts to that, if you will. But that isn't to say that the Joint Budget Committee and the members don't also find things to put forward themselves or in order to change or alter the budget.
Okay. Well, since we're with you at the moment, Ashley, could you talk a little bit about how the pandemic affected your work?
Yeah, so, and I know Tom will speak to this too, but we were about a few weeks away from finalizing the fiscal year budget when the pandemic really hit. So what we had to do is 3 things simultaneously. We had to estimate the economic impact. We had to rebalance the current year budget and the next fiscal year budget. And then we also had to fund the response to the pandemic. This is just a friendly reminder, but the pandemic actually hit most agencies, not just the public health agencies. So there was a lot of weighing really tough choices while also redoing our own budget. And then another kind of big component that was very different is that states received a lot of funds through the CARES Act and also through Families First, which is a lesser known stimulus bill, but that gave us a bump in the FMAP, which really helped out. But we were also trying to figure out the best allocation of those resources, knowing that they were probably one-time resources. So how can we use them to alleviate pressures on our budget, but also fund a response to a pandemic? And this was an unprecedented pandemic because it wasn't just a pandemic, it was a pandemic as well as an economic crisis happening at the same time. So we're all responding to those two things at the same time. And it made this budgeting season definitely very interesting. We have a joke in our office that we did the budget 3 times this year, as opposed to the normal 1 time.
So is the CARES Act money all gone?
Most of it has been allocated, not all of it has been spent. We're really trying to hit that December 30th deadline, get that money out the door. Our goal is to send $0 back to the feds. So it really takes a village to get that money out and get it spent. So we're constantly talking to departments, seeing where the money is. I also work with local governments, trying to get the money out, make sure it's spent and spent in a responsible way to make sure it's the highest need, but also that it complies with the CARES Act guidance.
Okay, thank you. And Tom, while we're on the budget topic, could you speak to all the hoops that you folks had to jump through for the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, it was Mr. Toad's wild ride for sure. As Ashley said, we were literally days away from finalizing the 2021 budget when we got the economic forecast. The way we operate is we base our sort of our revenue and budgetary figures off of what that March forecast is. And we do that every year. So we're not, that in and of itself wasn't anything different than how we normally operate. We're normally operating, setting the budget in February and March, sort of with the assumptions based off of the December forecast, with an underlying sort of implied assumption that the March forecast will be within a fairly decent margin of error of what those December figures look like. This past year, obviously, that didn't happen, and so we were probably about a week out from finalizing the budget and getting all the documentations prepared, getting the bill written, getting all the narratives that we do, all the supporting publications that we do. We were right on the cusp of getting that rolling and getting the bill across the street when we got that. We got the March forecast, and it was pretty. Fortunately we're just upstairs from LCS, so kind of that morning we already kind of had a sense of what was going to come, because they're starting to let us know, like, hey, just as a heads up, the presentation we're about to give isn't going to be so rosy for everyone. So we had at least a little bit of a heads up that the bottom had kind of fallen out from under us. And so, the forecast hit on, I think it was like the 16th. Pretty much immediately, we put a full stop on making any more budgetary decisions, setting any more lines. I think we maybe had 1 or 2 more sort of large items that we had to come back to that had been tabled through the process, that we had to, essentially we hit the big pause button on everything that we were doing, and regrouped and said, okay, we are now looking at a completely different budgetary scenario than we were looking at based off of the December forecast. And so as Ashley said, we essentially, the afternoon of March 16th, started refigure setting for the entire state government. That only became more evident and more prevalent as we progressed through March and into April, when COVID really became evident in its economic impact, and just the level and the depth in which we were looking at what the revenue impacts were going to be. And so we, as we kept an eye on what was going on nationally in the state, we were able to sort of see this trend of, that next forecast that we get, and I think it was in May when we had the sort of midstream forecast that we usually have, we were already preparing for and working with our department saying, hey, look, that March forecast was bad, but I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that we're looking at some really deep cuts that we're going to have to make because of the revenue impacts that we're seeing and the economic impacts we're seeing from COVID. So between March and April, there was a lot of, we were working hand in hand with our departments and with OSPB in order to find those areas that could sustain those types of cuts that we needed to make in order to meet both our constitutional and statutory obligations for spending increases. Because we're in a very unique budget environment in the state where there are year-over-year constitutional requirements for spending increases in certain sectors that forced some deeper cuts than if those weren't there. But those requirements have always been sort of there, and we always know that they're there, and so we're able to plan for them. But it did make it a little bit, it made it really difficult to find the necessary cuts, either within, let's say, K-12, within the Department of Education. They're required to increase spending year over year, even in a time when we're looking at significant revenue declines. And so we as the staff had to work really closely with our departments to ensure that not only were they part of that solution, but that we weren't making any recommendations that were going to have unnecessarily negative impacts, both in the short, medium, and long term. The pandemic, and it continues to impact how we operate a little bit. We've kind of gotten into a routine now. We're a little bit more settled with how we're operating. But that month and a half or 2 months between when the General Assembly took a break and when they came back, those were very busy weeks and months for JBC, for the department staff, for OSPB, as we all tried to find out what that best path forward was. And it really, I was very impressed with how everybody reacted, at least in the budget sphere, how everybody reacted. Everybody knew and could see what was happening. The departments understood that, cuts were coming down the pipeline, and they understood that working with us was the best way to go forward. OSPB was right there helping us coordinate with the departments, making sure that those areas that were priorities were focused on while trying to make those really tough balancing actions. And ultimately, our job is to present the options, good, bad, or ugly, to the committee, and the committee was there to make the decision, and they spent 3.5 weeks, 16, 20-hour days essentially between their work on mic and all the other work that they had to do with their colleagues and their caucuses. It was those 3-4 weeks in May were long, but they were very, it was nice to see that in this crisis, both the branches, both OSPB and the departments and us were able to sit down and work together and really come up with some solutions that really did help.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Thanks for all your work, both of you folks that were involved with the budget aspects. We know it was a tough time, and you've really told us, given us a lot more technical about how tough it was. So thank you. I'd like to move back to Sharon for a second, and Sharon, if you could talk about how this kind of split session affected the work that you and your group do, and then I'll be asking Manish the same. Thank you.
Well, I think hopefully everyone's getting the feel that although folks think that when the pandemic first happened, everyone got to stay at home and were in their sweatpants and got to clean out their closets and stuff. Folks dealing with the government, they were not doing that. We were very, very busy. Our emphasis at the very beginning, when the General Assembly first took its 2-week temporary adjournment, the big issue for us and the General Assembly was how was the adjournment, temporary adjournment, going to work into the 120-day calendar day limitation on session? Because if those 2 weeks or longer counted against 120 days, then there was going to be an issue that by the time that the General Assembly, it might be safe to come back and actually do something, then there might not be any time left for session to actually occur. And that under sort of the general understanding, as the General Assembly has operated for years and years, ever since it's had a calendar day limitation, is that it has a joint legislative rule that specifies that the calendar days are counted consecutively, so that every day counts regardless of whether the General Assembly meets or not, including weekends or temporary adjournments. However, there was back in 2009 another joint legislative rule that was adopted, and it basically came out of some pandemic scares that occurred back in those days. I think the bird flu, and there were some other types of viruses that people were afraid there might be this type of pandemic, and how would the legislature operate? And so back in 2009, the General Assembly adopted another joint legislative rule that said that if the governor declared a public health disaster emergency, that then the 120 days were to be counted as working days rather than consecutively. And so those working days would only be if the General Assembly actually met. So if that rule was in place and operating, and this rule has never, until now, had never been triggered since its adoption in 2009, there was this whole question of, well, is this rule any good, or does it violate the Constitution? Because if it was working days, then being in adjournment, whether for 2 weeks or 2 months, as the General Assembly ended up being in temporary adjournment, then it wouldn't matter. They would still have the remainder of session to do whatever they needed to do, adopting the budget, doing other bills to address the pandemic, and things like, passing the School Finance Act. So the first thing that happened on the last day before the General Assembly temporarily adjourned, they passed a joint resolution which posed an interrogatory to the Colorado Supreme Court. And an interrogatory is basically a question. It poses a question to the Supreme Court, asking the court to exercise original jurisdiction as to whether or not this Joint Rule 44, which said that if you're in this pandemic situation, a public health disaster emergency, the days are counted as working days. Is that constitutional? So they passed the resolution. That was filed with the Supreme Court. Then the General Assembly adjourned, temporarily adjourned, then for 2 weeks. So on Monday, the interrogatory was filed with the court, and later that day, the Supreme Court accepted the interrogatory, which then meant that briefs had to be filed within a week so that the court could hear all the arguments, and there were arguments for and against. It ambiguous because the constitutional language itself just says calendar days. It doesn't say how they're to be counted. And so you ended up having briefs filed by various parties, everybody from, I think there were quite a few members that filed separately that basically claimed that they had to be counted consecutively. You had the General Assembly's brief that argued that Joint Rule 44 and working days was okay. And then you had other folks, including former legislators that were involved with the constitutional amendments back in the day that imposed a calendar day limitation on the General Assembly to begin with. So it was very busy. We were trying to work remotely as best we could. Unfortunately, a lot of this legislative history going back into the 80s is all hard copy. And so we had quite a few people actually still on site, working with outside counsel, emailing a lot of documentation, trying to get audio from state archives in terms of when legislation was going through the process in terms of what the intent was for these constitutional calendar day limits. And so that was very, very busy. We got the briefs done in a week, and by April 1st, the Supreme Court came out with their decision, a 4-3 decision, that said that the working days counting was constitutional. So that gave the General Assembly some breathing room in terms of knowing that any temporary adjournment was not going to count against the 120-day limit. And they could start then thinking about, okay, what are we going to do next? I mean, you've had OSPB and JBC's take, that they were focusing on the budget, funding state government. But there's lots of other issues. There's all this legislation that had already been introduced and was sort of midstream in the legislative process. What do they do with that? Especially in light of the changing revenue situation, and a lot of those bills were requiring additional money, which probably wasn't going to fly. You also had bills that have what are called referendum clauses that they take effect depending on when it's 90 days after the General Assembly adjourns sine die. Usually that would happen in early May, and so you might have legislation that was drafted with internal dates assuming that the General Assembly was going to adjourn in May, when now a lot of those bills had to be modified to reflect a later date, whether they wanted to go with a safety clause or whether they wanted to push it out, so because then those bills wouldn't take effect till September. So there were all sorts of issues, and then just legislative procedure issues, like if it was going to be safe to come back, how were they going to operate? Could they have members participate remotely? Even the JBC had the issue of, could they hold their budget hearings that they were having on the new budget for 2021, could they do that remotely with the building closed down and everyone under a stay-at-home order? So there were so many questions because the General Assembly had never been in this position before, and so we had a lot of work to do in terms of trying to assist them in figuring out how to come back to session, what they were going to do, and how they were going to proceed.
Wow. That's incredible. I mean, you've all described an incredible amount of work that had to be done that most of us never thought about what's even going on. So thank you. Manish, you're up next, but real quick before we start, Rich is going to be asking some audience questions after you finish your part here, Manish, and then we'll go on from there. So please go ahead. Thank you.
So as Sharon said, it was a lot of work during the break in between. It's kind of hard to even define that term. It's like, what was that exactly? Year over years, for years, I have been in the legislature for just under 17 years. Sharon knows a lot more about it, but I don't think we've had a precedent to what we did this year. So at a very basic level, it threw off everybody's cadence, on the calendar, the legislative calendar. There are things happening at set times in the calendar, and all of that just threw everybody off. So the first step was to have staff be able to work from home. We did set off, we have some disaster recovery protocols, and we set those plans in place. So we had to scramble to make sure we could deploy resource technology and assist staff in working from home. That was the first huge change, because the legislative staff is always in the three buildings, the Capitol building and the adjoining two buildings on either side during session. That is just the expectation. So that was a big change coming in play. We kicked off by doing a lot of research on COVID-related queries and issues that folks may have, and we put out a resources page for the public. Put that in the chat here. There were memos written about the federal legislation. That was 3 pieces of federal legislation that were passed in response to COVID-19 in March 2020. We have a memo out there on the governor's executive orders. We tried to put together as many resources as possible. There were FAQs on what rental and housing assistance is available for people affected by COVID, or what about filing and eligibility of unemployment benefits and pandemic unemployment assistance, on evictions and foreclosures occurring during this public health emergency. So there's a lot of information that we put together and posted on our website to help legislators answer questions for their constituents and for the public to come and review that information by themselves. Since March 13th till date, we have had about 710 constituent service requests that we've answered related to this. So that's a huge number. Typically, we do that in a year, actually a little less than that in a whole year. And this is what we've done in 6 months. So that was just the immediate reaction, right? Okay, now what? And as soon as there was some level of, okay, what do we look forward to now is now once we come back, as Sharon was talking about the legal challenges, while their legal services was focused on that, we were focused on when they come back, how do we manage it? So there was a two-pronged approach there. One was from a public health, health protocols perspective. Another one was procedurally. When the session starts, how are we going to manage that in a remote hybrid scenario? Other than just the fact that, notwithstanding the rules and regulations, we wanted to be prepared to make sure if the rules were changed that we were able to respond quickly. We did not want to say we as staff, we were not able to, comply with changes to the rules. So we started working on that. We had regular meetings and practice sessions with legislators to come up with procedure and guideline recommendations on how potential hybrid floor and committee sessions would happen. Again, as I said, notwithstanding rules and legal aspects of this. This is just more practical aspects, as in how would it actually operate? Operationally, how would we do this? We reached out to NCSL and they conducted a few sessions on how other states are doing. We watched New York, Wyoming, Wisconsin, Utah. Oregon was getting started, do actually have some of these hybrid or all remote sessions. So we were able to discuss that with them and work with them on that. We had to make a number of changes. We had to work on, and speaking to the technology side of things, we had to procure software services and remote voting software, remote meeting like Zoom. We had to procure that, the technology like that. We had to make train members to use that more and more. In the chamber floor sessions in the House, we had members seated in the gallery to allow for enough social distancing. If they were in the gallery, how would they participate in voting? And their buttons were at their desks to vote. So it seems pretty innocuous, but they're pretty complicated to kind of actually overcome some of these issues. They're not as huge or like they don't show up as much as, say, the budget issues, and they shouldn't. But it is challenging for a member to vote when they're in the gallery and not at their desk hitting a button that's associated with them. So we had to work around that. We had to make sure we had enough PPE, like face masks and mic covers. All the mics had to have covers everywhere. We had to put together technology that allowed members to access amendments electronically. We are a pretty paper-based organization. Amendments are physically printed, handed out to legislators and committees on the floor. We had to come up with ways to distribute these electronically on the fly. So those are some of the things that we had to adjust to. And then, of course, all of this did have impact on our future projects, and we had to adjust for all of that, but that's a whole separate topic. But just for the second part of the session, we had to make a number of adjustments. We had a number of members attend remotely, so we had to have staff available to kind of make sure they can connect and are available and can attend without any issues, without any glitches. We had to reduce the number of committees so bills were funneled into a few committees instead of all the committees meeting, so committee staff had to rotate that. Fiscal analysts had to provide fiscal notes to legislators electronically instead of being in person to explain it. So there were operational changes that we had to put in place and get through the rest of the session.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, that's a huge amount of work that everybody's had to do. So thanks for sharing all that. Rich, do you have some audience questions for the group? You're on mute, Rich.
Yeah, I sure do. I'm probably going to combine them a little bit because some of them are in the same topic area.
Sure.
So get ready. First, though, I want to mention that I think we're probably going to take a short break at around 10:30. Our main sponsor for the event today is going to be joining us, and we have to be respectful of our sponsors, and so we'll take a little bit of time to have them talk. But let me get started. Actually, I think the first thing I can do is combine a couple of questions that I think Manish is probably best to answer because I think they relate to fiscal notes. The questions about with the allowance staff for input from outside of staff regarding fiscal impact beyond just the statutory impact. What have you seen as to the outside input have you gotten? Or maybe it's best to just ask you to explain that process and how that affects committee considerations. I'm guessing that relates at least somewhat to like the demographic notes and that sort of thing. And the other part to that question is the time frame that the fiscal notes look at. It says here they're limited to 3 years. I thought maybe it was even limited to 2. So, but why is it limited that way? And what kind of strategic decision making can occur if you're not looking at longer term impacts of a bill? So if you want to take a crack at that, Manish.
For sure. So right at the outset, I want to make sure everybody's aware I'm not a fiscal notes person, so I will try to answer it to the best of my knowledge. And I have Bill Zepernick on my instant messaging, and I'm asking him some questions. So he answered a little bit. Bill Zepernick is the fiscal notes manager. He says for ballot measures, proponents and interested parties can submit fiscal estimates for the ballot measure, and we consider that information. For committees, people are free and welcome to testify in committee on what they view the fiscal impact as. So that was his answer specifically to that. I am going to reach out to him right now to check in on why the fiscal notes are limited to the 2-year time frame horizon versus more than that, and I'll get back to you on
Okay,
that.
so we can revisit that. Sure, that's fine. Yeah, Tom, go ahead.
I can speak a little bit, at least to the time frame in terms
Sure.
of fiscal notes. We don't do dynamic forecasting or any sort of like true predictive modeling for these types of for legislation, and so we limit it to for normal bills, it's 2 fiscal years. In some cases, you'll see a third on the fiscal note. For corrections bills that impact, I believe it's that impact like sentencing, then you have to have a 5-year fiscal impact in the fiscal note. We limit, or my understanding is that those limits are in place because of the uncertainty in the out years in terms of legislative impact, revenue impacts, sort of because of the way and the methods we use for forecasting. It doesn't really allow for a truly accurate assessment in those out years of those 3 to 5 year out year impacts. We're really just limiting it to those 2 years because that's where we have the greatest confidence in the data that we're presenting. You know, anything outside of those 2 years, you're now talking about what are the other impacts of other pieces of legislation that may have been passed subsequent to that piece, to that bill. And so we try to limit those fiscal impacts to those timeframes that we can actually be comfortable and confident in our assessments of those impacts. And so that 2-year time frame really is sort of a product of the uncertainty of forecasting impacts of legislation. And so that's why you see such a limited time frame in fiscal notes.
Okay. Thanks, Tom. And I think I got several questions here that all fall, I think, pretty much under the budgeting process. So I'm going to try to read through some of these and maybe make sure, probably mostly Ashley and Tom, but certainly Sharon and Manish can jump in if you think there's something else you want to add. Maybe take some notes as I read through these down. So I've got a question about how does the JBC and OSPB work together with the departments for decision items and supplementals? And we certainly saw you guys working a lot together during this last budget process. And then another question relating to that is, when do the departments have to submit their budgets? And let's see.
I think there's also a question about cuts, right?
Yeah, you guys can see the question and answers too.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
good.
I can start and kind of.
You want to just jump in and try to answer as many of those as you can.
Yeah. So July 15th.
Save me reading them all.
July 15th is when departments submit their decision items to us at OSPB. And then sometime in August, they also submit their supplementals, their 1331s, their capital requests. But basically, as soon as we get their decision items, we work through with the departments on what are the highest needs, what is the evidence either of the effectiveness or non-effectiveness of the program. What's the data showing there's an increased need for this? Thinking especially ones that are caseload driven. Are those trend lines? Are they up? Are they flat? Are they down? So we work with the departments to then come up with a package. This year, we've asked departments to submit a 10% reduction based on our previous forecast. When we move forward with the budget, not every department is going to be at 10%. Obviously, there are some departments that during a recession have higher needs with the population that they're serving. So it was sort of an exercise to see where we could both reduce and then invest strategically. And then as soon as we're done all that, we submit it to the JVC, or we submit the budget, and then the JVC does a very similar look at where's the data, where's the evidence. And also by that point in time, some of the trend lines have changed, some of the amounts have changed. So that's kind of the over budget process from my end, and then I'll let Tom take over on how we work with the departments on supplementals and decision items.
Yeah, so I mean, that's right. That's perfectly said. You know, from the JBC's perspective, it really starts on November 1, or the first business day of November, I think is the technical time when the budget is thrown across the street or tossed over the fence from the executive to the legislature. And our role is very similar to what OSPB does. You know, it's obviously a tad adversarial, our just the nature of what we do. And so we as the legislative analysts, legislative side of the budget, you know, our job and our responsibility is to assess and evaluate the requests that are being made. And then, you know, our budget documents that we get from OSPB and from the departments are very detailed, and you can see the incremental changes from past pieces of legislation, from past budget requests. You can see technical adjustments that are being requested. And so we filter through not just the sort of top line budget requests or decision items that are being requested, but we go through pretty much every line item and look at, you know, what are the factors that are built into the base numbers? What are the adjustments for the upcoming year? You know, not every line item in every department gets adjusted year over year. Some do for caseload considerations or any sort of inflationary adjustments that might be necessary. And so there's a lot of nuance that goes into it, but generally speaking, you know, we provide that next level of analysis and evaluation beyond what OSPB does provide. And that's not to say that OSPB doesn't, you know, work their tails off to get the decision items across the street to us, but, you know, we're kind of the wood chipper at the end of it. And so they've gone through, they pruned the trees, they've kind of like made everything look pretty. It's what they present is pretty much functional at some level, and then they throw it to us and we just run it through the wood chipper to see if we can come up with something similar, something the same. We don't do zero-based budgeting in a normal year. This year was very abnormal in that we had to go back to the bases of every department, of every line, and see where we could find those cuts. But in a normal budget process, in a normal budget year, we don't have the capacity. We have 13 people doing 24 departments worth of work. And so we don't necessarily have the staff capacity to do zero-based budgeting every year. And so we rely to a certain extent on those decision items, on those request items from the executive to help us focus our discussions and our analyses. That isn't to say that our staff don't have the ability and jurisdiction and authority and expectation that if we find something that we think the committee needs to know about, we can bring that to them independent of what OSPB has requested, what any of the departments have requested. And so, you know, we're really that next step in the dialogue that happens when we're trying to construct these budgets. And our job is to really say, you know, we, over the past 4 or 5 years, have really tried to intertwine evidence-based policy decisions and evidence and real, you know, concrete, as much concreteness as we can into our analyses and base a bunch of our recommendations off of the evidence that we see, particularly in areas like public safety or public health or human services or HICPUF. You know, we're trying to focus more and transition more to an evidence-based model for how we budget. And so we're in the midst of that transition. This was really sort of a relatively new tool in our toolbox that we're trying to implement on a consistent and conscious level through the budget process. So we'll talk about it during briefings. We'll talk about evidence-based policy during figure setting. I know OSPB goes through all of their requests and assigns what they feel is the right level of evidence-based policy for some of their requests. And so we're really trying to be as open and honest and transparent with how we analyze and how we make our recommendations and how we arrive at those recommendations. It's why our documents tend to be very lengthy. Particularly our figure setting documents tend to be very lengthy, is because we want to be able to stand by our recommendations, even if the committee goes a different direction. And so, we work hand in hand as much as we can with OSPB and the department, while acknowledging that our job is largely oversight and analysis. And so we're here as a check. And so it can get adversarial, the questions can get pointed. But generally speaking, we work very well with our departments, and we work very well with OSPB to get the information to the committee and to the decision makers in such a fashion that it's not just easily digestible, but also supported by the evidence in front of us. And so we do look at caseload and trend lines and past expenditures versus future expenditures, the age of the program and what its intent is. And so if you get a request for a program that's been around for a long time, we tend to dig pretty deeply into those types of programs. Newer programs are a little bit more tough to assess because they don't have that breadth of data. But we work very closely with our departments and the program personnel too, to get a sense of what the request is meant to do, what generic request A is meant to do, whether it seems like the requested resources would allow the program to achieve the goal that it's stating that it wants to achieve. And so we try to make sure that we check off as many of those boxes as we can as we develop our analyses, so that when we're presenting our recommendations to the committee, anyone and everyone who wants to read through our documents can see the logic and can see the rationale behind the recommendation. We very much try not to just blindly make a recommendation without any supporting evidence or any supporting argument for why we've made that recommendation, particularly on those areas that are either the topic of the day or something that's a little bit more of a long-term issue that we're looking at. We really do try to work with the departments and work with OSPB to get that analysis robust enough so that the committee can make and then justify their decision to their colleagues across the street.
Great, thanks, Tom. Bob, should we take a break for a moment to allow our sponsor to speak? Do you want to go ahead and introduce her? Unmute. Unmute, Bob.
I got it. Sorry. Thank you.
Yes, we all do it.
A short sponsor break for Caitlin Clamp, who is the Marketing and Admissions Coordinator at the Office of Social Work Student Services at Metropolitan State University. So Caitlin, you're on.
Thank you so much. MSU Denver's Department of Social Work is really excited to be a sponsor for this webinar series. And I just wanted to use this chance to let all of the attendees know a little bit about who we are, what we do. I know that one of our professors, Christiane team, is also in the chat and in the attendees room. I'm hoping to get him switched over to panelists so that he can chat a little too. The mission of the Department of Social Work at MSU Denver is to provide an inclusive, inspiring environment for undergraduate, graduate, and community education in social work that's value-driven, research-informed, culturally responsive, academically rigorous, and which links theory with practice. We offer both an undergraduate Bachelor of Science in Social Work program, as well as a graduate-level Master in Social Work program. Both programs use a generalist curriculum, which allows our students to be exposed to micro, meso, and macro practice, because we know that social workers need those hands-on skills as well as the legislative and advocacy skills to make a change in their communities. At the graduate level, we do allow students to focus in on their areas of interest through pathways, which are advising recommendations on the electives that they might want to take. Those pathways include things like gerontological social work, leadership and management, social work and healthcare. I think we're up to about 9 or 10 different pathways to really allow students to focus in. And those electives, both at the undergraduate and graduate level, are really how they can focus in on their areas of interest. Our department also is really big, as mentioned in the department mission, into community education and partnerships. So we have several workforce development stipend programs. I know in the past we were recipients of the HEALS program, which is social work, healthcare education, and leadership scholars. That allowed students to really dig into some of that legislative advocacy work, as well as learning the skills to work in healthcare. We also sponsor every year the Palliative Care Social Work Conference. This upcoming spring will be the 12th annual conference, as well as a social work policy conference that just had its 4th annual conference this past Friday. Our faculty and students are really involved in the MSU Denver Champions and MSU Denver Day at the Capitol, which is where they get to do that legislative advocacy work. And our Office of Field Education maintains relationships with over 700 agencies throughout the state. So that's just a brief overview of who we are and what we do. And I wanted to let Christian speak a little bit more to our work with preparing students to work with older adults and legislative work.
Thanks, Caitlin. Greetings, folks. One of the many hats I wear is a professor of social work at MSU Denver. I'm also the current chair of Colorado's Strategic Action Planning Group on Aging. And I think social work is uniquely positioned in the way that we've been thinking about aging in the state of Colorado, which is very much from an integrated perspective, that you can't look at just one part of aging. It really is a total process, and social work has and brings that lens to that issue. I would also say that one of the things we've been working a lot on is encore careers, and I think social work is an amazing encore career for those older Coloradans who want to continue to be a part of the workforce. We've had many folks in our social program who are in their 50s, 60s, and I believe into our 70s. So, you know, it is certainly something that if you have an interest in doing practice from a more clinical lens or even a more policy-oriented lens, the social work degree can be an amazing tool to help you gain those skills and position you through internships. We've had many internships within the legislature and within the governor's office. So, and certainly many of our different branches within the executive branch, human services, HICPUF. So I would certainly invite folks to consider social work from that perspective as well. Also, if you have folks that you are connected to, let them know about MSU Denver. We are singularly the most affordable and most grounded in a diversity-based perspective in the state of Colorado and potentially in the country as well. We are one of the most affordable programs in the entire U.S. So we invite you to share who we are and what we're about.
Yeah, and if folks are interested in connecting or learning more or partnering with our department, you can reach out to us. The email address is just socialwork@msudenver.edu. And we'd be happy to tell you more about what we do, who we are, or talk about partnerships and ways to help people further their interest and work.
Well, thank you, Christian and Caitlin. And MSU has been a great partner with working with CSL, and we really appreciate the work that SAPCA is doing. And we work very closely with SAPCA on their recommendations and working to get some of those recommendations implemented. So we appreciate all the work that Christian does there as well. So thanks for joining us this morning, and thanks for being a sponsor.
Thanks, Bob. Glad we can help you guys.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. And back to our 4 panelists, you've probably had a little bit of an opportunity to see some of the chat that has come in and maybe some of the other questions. So Rich,
yeah,
take it.
I thought I see like basically 3 more basic topics. One relating to again, this this idea about it's on budgeting again. How or to what extent are agencies' budgets looked at interconnectedly, or are they kind of standalone? And so is there any effort to assess the impact of a decision being made in one area or for one department's program or budget, and how that might affect how another program works in a different department. And then there's also questions about how the Federal CARES Act, and I think also Families First monies have been spent. And some of that I think was touched on earlier, but if you can see the questions here, if there's additional information to provide on those. One part of that question is how any of that money helps people get back to work. And then I think the third topic gets us back to part of the name of this sponsor of this event, the senior lobby. So there's questions about to what extent do the departments consider aging when they do their budgets? What's the other one here? And of course, a lot of us pay attention to the Older Coloradans Fund, but there's a lot of other programs in the state that affect older Coloradans, and vice versa. The aging of the population can have a relationship to how other programs are developed. So that's a lot, but maybe if we can start with the question about the CARES Act and the Families First Act and the federal funds, if you want to add anything else on those.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about the different CARES Act, Family First. There's another one in there whose number I can't remember. But as Tom said earlier, it's really important to be transparent, especially when it comes to budgeting. So OSPB actually has a part of their website that's just about emergency funds. We have all the presentations that we've given, both to the JBC and presentations the governor has given. We have all of the executive orders as well that allocated funding. And we also have reports that we have to give to the Treasury in regards to our CARES Act funding. The thing I want to stress about how interesting or important the CARES Act is there's three kind of buckets that the CARES Act provided. There's money that came to the state of Colorado, and everybody talks about this Title V funding, which was kind of here's a bunch of money, get it out the door. So we obviously have an accounting for all of that. But there are two other buckets people don't talk about enough that are really important for our state. The second bucket is just money that came to the state of Colorado through existing programmings. So the one I obviously on top of my mind right now is the AAA's got a non-significant amount of funding through the CARES Act. And we've made sure to represent that in a lot of our reporting. But then there's that third bucket that is money that came to people in Colorado but never hit the state budgets. So you think of the $1,200 stimulus checks, you think of the money that went to hospitals. It's really hard to account for that. We've done our best effort at trying to account for that and trying to make sure that when we're thinking about budgeting and we're thinking about what of our Title V money is going to come out and where it goes, that we know where that other money is going. So because hospitals received more money than I think our state did, we're probably not going to be sending as much money to hospitals as we will be sending to schools and other areas that are involved in pandemic response. So that's my pitch for don't just think about Title V funding when you talk about CARES, think about all the different streams of funding that came in, how hard it is to account for that, and how we really did try to account for that and then represent it out. The last thing I'm going to say is that Colorado has been doing a lot better at both accounting for the money, but also getting the money out the door than a lot of other states. And you'll see that in Treasury reports where they go state by state and county by county for the counties that got direct allocations, county by county, and Colorado's just doing a great job getting out the door. So I just want to do that pitch, and I'll share the website in the chat box.
Great.
And I can certainly speak to how we coordinate across departments, at least here at the JBC, for any sort of decision items or areas that would impact a program or multiple programs across departments. There's a couple ways this is done. Fortunately, we're a very small staff and we're very collaborative, so there's a lot of discussion between analysts about their decision items whenever they get them in November. And we sort of all kind of, through our conversations, we get a sense of, oh, who has what. Oh, you might want to, you with human services may want to talk to the higher ed analyst because it looks like there's some decision items that cross over topic areas. And so there is that informal collaboration and informal discussions that are had. OSPB and the governor, when they send over their transmittal letters and their budget requests, they will also highlight, this decision item here is a group of decision items that we have to address this underlying issue, and it touches these 5 departments. And so along the way, through our budget documents, we have a way of tracking if there's a decision item in, say, the Department of Agriculture that impacts the Department of Natural Resources, there's ways that we have designed our budget request documents that you can see that this decision, this primary decision in Department A is going to have this filter on effect in Department B because Department B is paying for or providing some service for Department A. And so you'll see reappropriated funds through a non-prioritized decision item, sort of linking these 2 departments in this one decision. From a staff perspective, that's helpful, but where we really find the collaboration across departments is in that analyst to analyst discussion. We're a very close-knit group over here, so we know what each other are doing, what those big decision items are. A lot of times when we're handing off or transitioning departments between analysts, the analyst who had that department is still on staff. And so we can talk and say, hey, look, I know that the Department of Higher Education is going to have some issues that are going to translate into issues for the Department of Human Services. The 2 of you should really, or the 3 of you should really talk about what that means and where those impacts are seen. We try to do our best with that. Sometimes things do slip through the cracks. Ultimately, at the end of the day, each department is figure set in a standalone fashion to a certain extent, in that we are determining the specific line items for each division in each department and assessing how that looks for that department in and of itself. If there are decision items or a group of decision items that we think need to be discussed and considered holistically and as a group, we will inform the committee in our analyses, whether it's during the briefings in November and December, or during figure setting in February and March. We will say, hey, this decision item not only impacts the Department of Human Services, but also impacts the Department of Education in K-12. And so we'll say, this thing here, this specific decision item, you may want to table or hold off on making a decision until you have the full picture and you're able to talk with the analysts for the other departments. And so that the committee oftentimes will table an item for future consideration because they want to have that full picture. They want to talk to all the department analysts dealing with this suite of decision items to really sort of figure out what's the best path forward. Because a lot of times what's happened is some of these groupings of decision items tend to be the result of a lot of interim work that's done through interim committees. And so the legislators already sort of been engaged by the executive branch, by the departments and OSPB in discussions on solutions for whatever that issue might be. And so sometimes, and this happened last year actually, interim committees will present policy solutions and programmatic solutions that are running in parallel to solutions and proposals presented by OSPB and the executive branch. And so, part of our job as analysts here is to know the lay of the land and to be able to say, while this one specific decision item is dealing with this one minute thing, it is part of this broader picture that we're looking at. And it's not just, oh, the executives decided that this is an issue. We've been having this discussion as a legislature for a year, for 2 years, specifically during the interim where we can actually focus on some of the more meaty areas of these issues. And so it's giving the committee the opportunity to see both the granular details, but also that holistic view of what it means to address early intervention or young child education in the state, or older Coloradan services in the state. Like those things, while they might be primarily in the human services, also have impacts across various departments. And it really is the committee, through our briefing and hearing and figure setting processes, tie those together and really try to get that holistic view of what it means to approve this one thing over here and what that knock-on effect is for future or for other departments.
Okay, thanks, Tom.
I just want to add that's the best value add of any kind of budget shop, whether it's JDC or OSPB, is that if you just ask individual departments what they would want, they might not think strategically, right? They're not always working together. I can tell you this, they're not always working together. They're not always knowing what the left hand is doing. So it really is a value add that the budget office sees it across services. My official title is the Deputy Director for Health, Human Services, and Criminal Justice, for that reason, so that I know if we're cutting jail-based services and Department of Human Services, what does that actually mean for the Department of Corrections?
Yeah.
And how those all interact. We don't get it right all the time, but we are trying to think strategically. Sometimes, because budget work is so hard and fast, we do need that longer term view, which is why some of these other committees come in that are very helpful, like the Behavioral Health Task Force just released their recommendations, and SAPCA. I have SAPCA's PDF on my computer, right? And reading it all the time to make sure that I'm also thinking strategically and not just focused on, let's say, the 5% of older Coloradans that use AAAs, but thinking about the rest of those older Coloradans and how we're helping them strategically.
Yep, great, thank you. I'm going to kind of jump away from that budget topic for a minute, and if you guys are looking at Q&As, you'll see our immediate past president, Ed Shackelford, has several questions. So I'd like to honor those. Particularly, he's concerned, I think, with one relating to access to the building. He says he really wants a handrail on the last 10 or so steps on the north entrance. Oh, because you got to go upstairs to get through the security, whereas otherwise you got to go all the way around to 14th Avenue to get through at ground level. So I don't know if that's a legislative council question, if you guys deal with the building, or if that's somebody completely different. And I don't know if you want to respond to that or relay that to those who can field that kind of question.
This is something that we could look at and work with DPA on. I don't know. I don't have an answer for this right now, but I will pass on this concern to the appropriate folks who can do a better job of responding to it. I don't know if you're aware, we are adding more signage around the Capitol building. So we are looking at doing more of that externally and inside the Capitol building too. I can definitely convey this concern moving forward.
All right, great, thanks. So I think, again, some of the other questions that we've got left do relate to, back on the budget issues, more specifically about older adults and senior programs. We've mentioned AAAs and older Coloradans funding. There's still some concerns that several of us have about that. What are some of these other questions here? I'm reading as we speak. Yeah, I think. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you feel comfortable commenting on a specific area like that. Obviously, it's an interest of this group. I've often described to people my perception that the budgeting process, particularly at the executive level prior to November 1st, as hermetically sealed, that you can make a request, but you never know how your request is being considered until the budget comes out on November 1st. So you may not be able, anybody on the panel may not be able to speak much about it, but maybe if it might help us if you could give at least some comments or perspectives about budgeting for older adults, and maybe real quick to, and I saw Tom, I'll have Tom go first and then see if Ashley wants to comment. As you mentioned, there are more there. I mean, obviously a lot of us pay attention to the area agencies on aging and their funding, but there are more programs in terms of transportation services, workforce programs. Senior Lobby's been involved over the last year in one related to trying to encourage more people to, more healthcare professionals to go into a geriatric specialty and those sorts of things. So I'll start with Tom, if you wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, so I'll split my response into sort of a normal year versus the type of situation we find ourselves in now. In a normal year, you know, budgetary considerations for older Coloradans is assessed on an ongoing basis. You know, we look at the line items. Obviously, our lives are kind of driven by the structure of the budget to a certain extent, but we look at, you know, we look at the past impacts of our budget. We request information from the department to be presented to the JBC. We've had an ongoing RFI for at least a couple years discussing the wait list and the backlog for AAA services. And we take those into consideration when we do our normal budgeting process. And in a normal year, any sort of incremental changes that we would be made with those considerations being taken into account. Now, in a situation like we find ourselves now, where an already vulnerable population is even more vulnerable, you know, it becomes a much higher priority in terms of maintaining funding at a level that allows our service providers to provide those services for our aging population. You know, we're in a very delicate time right now, in that we are at the front end of a demographic shift to a much older population. These types of services are going to be becoming more and more prevalent and necessary as we move forward. We just kind of got, I don't even want to say sidetracked, we just kind of got a boost in that urgency because of this year. You know, instead of trying to look at how we serve our older population in a strategic and long-term view, which is, you know, in March of this year, we were really trying to start off a conversation of what does providing services for seniors look like in the coming decade, in the coming 20, 50 years, and what can we do now to sort of set that ball rolling in the right direction with the right intent and the right level of resources. Like, what does that look like? And of course, in March, that focus changed. And so these next couple of years really are, how do we maintain and find the funding for those services that are really critical for this population. And it does help when the federal government steps in and provides program-specific funding, either through the Older Coloradans Act or the Social Security block. Like, right, we are very welcoming to that specific targeted funding from the federal government, because it really, in the short term, helps us buoy our ability to fund those services for our seniors. The consideration going forward is that's temporary relief. And, you know, to a certain extent, it's backfilling, I don't want to say backfilling, but it's filling a budgetary hole that we wouldn't necessarily have had in a normal year. And so it's temporary, and we have to make sure we keep that in mind, that this federal relief that we're getting isn't something that we can rely on in 5-10 years. This is really a stopgap measure. And so, you know, our considerations when we're looking at specifically older Coloradans and how we serve them through the budget is, how do we structure and how do we make decisions now and consider those decisions in the larger context of a shifting population and a shifting demographic? And how do we make those decisions now, even while we're in a crisis, where we're establishing those foundations to allow us to expand when we need to become more efficient where we need to provide the varying types of services that our seniors need, whether it's transportation, Meals on Wheels, you know, consultations for understanding medical advice from doctor, right? Like there's this whole suite of services that we need to be able to provide or allow our seniors to have access to. And we can't get distracted by the current crisis in trying to establish that foundation and that point from which we can launch into this, what is essentially a shifting population. And we're, to a certain extent, trying to guess what those services are going to look like and what what our seniors are going to need in 10, 15, 20 years. And, you know, we need to be able to build in the flexibility to make those adjustments in those out years and not be so distracted by the crisis that is immediately ahead of us that we're not looking forward to those out years.
We've kind of run over a little bit, so Ashley, you could.
Yeah, I totally, I feel like Tom and I just keep agreeing with each other, which doesn't normally happen, I promise. But yeah, I agree. We did an analysis this summer and found that there are over 70 different line items that go towards seniors in some way, shape, or form. And I know we talk a lot about AAAs, but there's a ton of other programs. And how are we thinking about this strategically, and how are we operating on this strategically? And I just want to emphasize something that Tom was saying, was that in this budget year, our mantra here at OSPB is, what are we protecting? What are we saving? Because there's going to be cuts and they're going to be painful, but what are we really protecting and saving? Knowing that 1 in 4 Coloradans are going to be over the age of 60 by 2030. So that's sort of the fire drill we're going through right now of, we might not be investing as much as we want, but what are we making sure that the investments continue at least the level that they are now, knowing that too, this pandemic has been disproportionately, I don't want to say unfair, but burdened by the older Coloradans. So I know we don't have any minutes left, so I just wanted to say that very quickly. And I'm very excited about, there's the next report coming out by Sept to see the final report, to see what other advice they have for us as well.
Great.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much, and thanks for everybody for sticking with us. We went over just a few minutes, and
Bob, I wanted to take a quick second to thank everybody personally too. I've worked with several of you at one time or another, and obviously Sharon and I go back quite a ways. Manish, you may know or may not know that I actually started out my career working at the Legislative Council for 6 years, way back in the 1980s. And obviously worked a lot with Tom more recently, and Ashley as well. So again, and we've worked with some of your staff and colleagues as well. And I've always, and maybe it's because I used to be a legislative staff person, but I've always really appreciated the professionalism and the willingness to work with folks when we come in and ask questions. So again, I just wanted to pass along those thanks.
Thanks, Rich. And we will be sending out an evaluation for all you attendees today. If you would please complete that, it'll come to you via email. And we again appreciate all the panelists who have joined us today, and thank you so much for all the work that you do. And it was very interesting to learn all the hoops that you had to jump through to keep the session going this year. So thanks again. And have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.